Here we are on top of Cairnpapel Hill, just outside Edinburgh. And I brought you up here because about 5,000 years ago, Neolithic farmers used to use this as a ceremonial site. And in fact, a lot of these stone holes here show where the huge pillars were that once held up the old site. It's a little bit like a Scottish type of Stonehenge, although unfortunately none of the big stones are now still standing and may well even have been timber. A lot of people think that herbal medicine is something new, something quite recent, but in actual fact it goes back through time immemorial. About 80,000 years ago we have the first proof that man was using herbs as medicines, and that was in Iraq at the Shanidar tombs. They found there that there was a medicine man type person buried with little pouches of herbs, about 8 different herbs, including things like yarrow, which we still use in herbal medicine today. Just in the distance you can see the hills of Edinburgh at Arthur's Seat, and that's where Duncan Napier, who founded Napiers in 1860, was born. He was a foundling and had quite an unhappy childhood, apprenticed to people and having to work from a very, very early age. And one of the trades that he did when he was only 13 or 14 was he was apprenticed to a miller, and the flower dust gave him an awful asthmatic type of cough. As he grew older and developed an interest in plants from having spent some time out of the city, and of course in those days the city was divided into lots of little villages, he got interested in plants and found out in an old herbal that there was a cure for a cough like his, made from lobelia. And he made up this cough mixture which successfully cured his cough. And as he learnt more and more about it, other people would start to ask him for cures as well. He became a member of the Botanical Society, which is now the Royal Gardens in Edinburgh. And on the 25th of May 1860, he opened his first store. The surrounding area, like here, is very much as it was in Duncan Napier's day. Small settlements in the distance and open countryside, where he and then later his sons would go early in the morning and gather herbs. If you read his diary, he would sometimes have been up and out by 4 o'clock in the morning to gather the herbs that he needed in the clinic for that day. And a lot of these herbs are still growing very much around us. Cairnpapel became a burial site, and inside this large mound there's a chamber in which there are large stones and tombs where people were buried. And one of the things that's quite interesting is that they recently excavated a similar aged Neolithic site at Fort Teviot in Perthshire to the north. And inside, when they exhumed the bodies, they found that they were wrapped in birch bark and covered with meadowsweet flowers. I remember I was driving to work when I heard this on the radio, and somebody on the news was saying, you know, how wonderful it was. It showed that our ancestors, even 5,000 years ago, were sentimental and liked to strew flowers on the grave. And I laughed because, of course, in ancient burials, people would be buried with the things that they needed for the afterlife, you know, their sword, their spear, their gold, and food and drink. And of course, meadowsweet has a use far, far beyond glorifying and celebrating a funeral. It's really good for arthritis and pain. It helps to settle the stomach because of the compounds it has, like salicylic acid. It's a sort of Neolithic aspirin. And of course people would have been buried with these flowers because partly they smelt sweet and they were pretty, but also because they could then flavour their mead in the afterlife and make a good cure for when they weren't feeling themselves. You might wonder why people would have been wrapped in birch bark as well. Well, birch bark contains natural antifungal compounds, so it's a fungicide, one of nature's fungicides. I mean, you have to remember that plants don't like fungus and bacteria and viruses any more than we do, and so they produce compounds which we harness to help ourselves as well. And the ancient people had found that birch bark, when it was made into a container and food was put in it, would actually keep it fresh for several days longer than if they didn't have it at all. So they probably used birch bark to wrap the bodies to prevent them decaying quite so quickly. And then of course birch bark, like willow bark and indeed meadowsweet, has got compounds that are anti-inflammatory as well as antifungal.